The string lights draped across my brother's backyard glowed like fireflies caught in amber. 200 guests mingled beneath their soft light champagne glasses, catching the reflection of a celebration I had no part in building. The mansion behind them, a sprawling colonial revival with white columns and a wraparound porch, stood like a monument to everything my family believed I would never achieve. I adjusted the strap of my dress, a navy blue number I had purchased at a consignment shop 3 years earlier. It still fit well, though the fabric had begun to show its age around the seams. My mother had noticed immediately when I arrived, her eyes traveling the length of the garment with barely concealed disappointment. "You could have bought something new," she had said. "This is a special occasion. Special for Noah. Never for me." I stood near the edge of the party, watching my brother accept congratulations from people whose names I barely remembered. Cousins twice removed business associates, neighbors who had known us since childhood. They all orbited around Noah like planets around a sun, drawn by the gravitational pull of his supposed success. At 35, he was the golden child my parents had always predicted he would become. Senior Vice President at Hollister Financial Group, a title that sounded impressive enough to silence any questions. And me, I was the sister in the second-hand dress, the one relatives glanced at with a mixture of pity and dismissal. 32 years old and still renting an apartment, still working at what they assumed was a dead-end job, still failing to meet the basic standards of success that seemed to come so naturally to everyone else. My father's voice cut through the jazz quartet's rendition of Something Forgettable. "Grace, come here. I want you to meet someone." I set down my untouched champagne and walked toward the cluster of family friends gathered near the outdoor bar. A caterer passed by with a tray of shrimp cocktail, the kind of appetizer that cost more per plate than my family had ever spent on my birthday dinners. My mother stood beside my father, her smile as practiced as a beauty pageant contestant's, her silver hair perfectly coiffed in a style that suggested she had visited an expensive salon earlier that day. Noah was there too, one arm around his wife, Bethany, a slender woman with sharp features who had always treated me with the kind of cordial distance reserved for distant relatives and service workers. His other hand held a crystal tumbler of scotch he clearly intended to savor. "This is my daughter," my father said to a silver-haired man I vaguely recognized as one of his golf partners. "She's still figuring things out." Still figuring things out. I was 32 years old. I had been working since I was 14. I had graduated college with honors and zero debt. But none of that mattered because I hadn't achieved success in a way my family could brag about at parties. The golf partner nodded politely, clearly uninterested. His eyes had already returned to Noah, where the real conversation was happening. My father continued, his voice carrying that particular edge of humor that was never really humor at all. "We keep telling her she needs to settle down, buy something, put down roots." He laughed, and the sound scraped against something raw inside me, a wound I had been carrying since childhood. "But this one, she'll rent forever. Can't seem to hold on to anything long enough to own it." The laughter that followed was polite, automatic. Social lubrication for an uncomfortable moment that everyone pretended was simply family banter. A joke, nothing serious. Just the kind of harmless ribbing that families engaged in at celebrations. Except it wasn't harmless. It had never been harmless. Noah took a long sip of his scotch, savoring both the liquor and the moment. "Moving house really suits you though, Grace. You've gotten pretty good at it by now." More laughter. My mother's eyes flickered to mine for just a moment, not with sympathy, but with something closer to agreement. She had always believed I was the lesser child, the one who worked with her hands instead of her mind, the one who would never amount to anything substantial enough to discuss at dinner parties. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, but I kept my expression neutral. 32 years of practice had made me excellent at wearing masks, at absorbing insults without flinching, at appearing calm while rage built inside me like water behind a dam. "You're right," I said, my voice steady as bedrock. "Moving is exactly what I do best." I excused myself and walked toward the garden path that wound away from the party. Behind me, the celebration continued. Clinking glasses, murmured congratulations. the sound of my family reveling in success they believed belonged only to Noah. They had no idea that the mansion casting its shadow over their party wasn't Noah's at all. The garden was quieter, lit by solar-powered lanterns that lined the stone pathway. I had walked this route dozens of times over the past 2 years, usually when family gatherings became too suffocating to endure. The roses were in full bloom, their fragrance mixing with the distant smell of grilled meat and expensive perfume. I pulled my phone from my clutch and typed a single word to Cole Harrington, the realtor, who had become both my business partner and my closest confidant. "Tonight." His response came within seconds. "Ready when you are." I slipped my phone back into my bag and allowed myself one small smile. For 30 months I had paid the mortgage on that house, every single payment. Noah hadn't contributed a dime since he lost his job at the bank 2.5 years ago, a detail he had managed to hide from everyone, including our parents. He didn't know I knew. He didn't know I had been covering for him this entire time, making payments through anonymous channels, keeping the foreclosure notices at bay, while he posted vacation photos on social media and accepted congratulations for achievements that existed only in his imagination. But tonight, the payments would stop, the locks would change, and the truth would finally crawl out from the shadows where my family had kept it buried. I returned to the party just long enough to watch Noah accept a toast from our father. The crowd had gathered around them, champagne glasses raised in unified celebration. My mother stood to the side, her expression radiant with reflected glory. "To success," my father proclaimed, his voice carrying across the manicured lawn. "To everything you've built, son. We always knew you would make us proud." Everything he'd built. The irony was almost too perfect. Every brick of that mansion's mortgage had been paid with my money. Every month of stability they enjoyed had been funded by the daughter they dismissed. 3 hours later, after the last guest had stumbled to their car and the catering staff had cleared away the remnants of celebration, my family returned to the mansion. I know this because Cole told me. He was waiting on the front porch when they arrived, a manila folder tucked under his arm and a locksmith's van parked in the driveway. Noah's key didn't work. He tried it 3 times, his confusion morphing into irritation, then something closer to panic. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice echoing across the empty street. Cole stepped forward, his expression professionally neutral. "Mr. Ellington, I'm afraid there's been a change in ownership status regarding this property." My father's voice boomed through the night. "Change in ownership. This is my son's house. We've been living here for years." Cole opened the manila folder and handed my father a stack of documents. "Actually, sir, the property has been owned by Ellington Mobility Group, LLC, since before your family moved in. The registered owner of that LLC is Grace Ellington, your daughter." The silence that followed must have been extraordinary. I wish I could have seen their faces. My father's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. My mother was clutching her purse in genuine shock. Noah stared at the documents as if they had been written in a foreign language. My phone lit up with notifications. 1 missed call, then 5, then 20, then 100. Finally a text from my mother. "What have you done?" I typed my response, slowly savoring each letter. "I stopped paying for a house that was never yours. The mansion was mine. It had always been mine. And my family, the people who had spent my entire life telling me I would amount to nothing, had just discovered they had been living on borrowed grace. Literally. Memory is a strange thing. It doesn't organize itself chronologically, doesn't file away moments in neat little folders labeled by year or significance. Instead, it clusters around wounds, around the moments that shaped us into whatever we've become. I was 7 years old the first time I understood that I was less than Noah in my parents' eyes. We were sitting at the dinner table, the 4 of us, plus my grandmother on my mother's side, a woman who smelled like lavender and disapproval. The dining room of our modest suburban home felt smaller somehow when she visited, as if her judgment took up physical space. Noah had just brought home a report card filled with A's, and my parents were passing it around like a sacred document. The cardstock was crisp, the grades written in careful blue ink, each letter a testament to my brother's superiority. "Look at this," my father said, his voice swelling with pride. "Top of his class in mathematics, in science. This boy is going places." I had my own report card in my backpack, B's and C's mostly, a single A in art class that I'd been excited about until that moment. My drawing of a sunset had won recognition in a school contest, but the certificate sat crumpled in my bag, suddenly worthless. "What about you, Grace?" my grandmother asked, her eyes sharp behind her bifocals. "How are your grades?" I opened my mouth to answer, but my mother spoke first. "Grace is more of a hands-on learner," she said, which sounded like a compliment until you heard the subtext. "She's better with practical things. Not everyone can be academic. Not everyone can be academic, as if academics were a gift bestowed upon the deserving, and I simply hadn't qualified. As if there were two categories of children, the ones destined for success and the ones destined for settling. Noah smirked at me across the table, a small, private expression that our parents didn't see. He knew exactly what that moment meant. He understood his position in the family hierarchy, and he enjoyed it. By the time I was 12, the division had solidified into something permanent. Noah received tutoring for his advanced placement courses paid for by our parents without a moment's hesitation. I received suggestions that I might consider vocational training, hints that college might not be right for everyone. Noah's college fund grew fat with contributions from relatives who believed in his future. My fund remained modest, almost apologetic in its existence, a token gesture toward equality that fooled no one. I started working at 14. Not because I had to, but because I understood that my value in this family would never come from being loved. It would have to come from being useful, from contributing something tangible that couldn't be dismissed or overlooked. My first job was at a car wash 3 blocks from our house. I spent my weekends scrubbing salt stains off SUVs and learning the particular satisfaction of transforming something dirty into something clean. The chemicals burned my hands, at first left them raw and cracked, but I learned to use gloves properly and to apply lotion before bed. The owner, a weathered man named Frank, who had immigrated from Poland in his 20s, taught me more about business in those first 6 months than any classroom ever would. "You watch people," he told me once, while we shared sandwiches during a break. The summer heat pressed down on us thick and heavy, but the shade behind the building provided relief. "You see what they need before they know they need it. That's the secret. Not grades, not diplomas. Just pay attention." I paid attention to everything. I noticed which customers tipped well and which ones complained regardless of quality. I noticed which services generated the most profit and which ones were barely worth offering. I noticed the rhythms of the business, busy weekends in spring, when everyone wanted their cars cleaned for outdoor events, slow periods in deep winter when ice and salt made washing seem pointless. Frank noticed me noticing. "You've got a good head," he told me at the end of that first summer. "You could run a place like this someday." I didn't tell my parents about that comment. They would have laughed or worse, pitied me for aiming so low. At 16, I took a second job at a sporting goods store. At 17, I added weekend shifts at a diner near the highway. My parents viewed my work ethic with a mixture of bewilderment and mild embarrassment, as if my employment reflected poorly on their ability to provide. "You don't need to work so much," my mother told me once, folding laundry while I counted my tips on the kitchen table. "It's not like you're saving for college like Noah." She was wrong. I was saving for college. I just knew better than to expect help. Noah, meanwhile, coasted through high school on a combination of genuine intelligence and strategic charm. He won scholarships. He won awards. He won our parents' unwavering devotion. The summer before he left for his full-ride scholarship at Stanford, my father threw him a party, not unlike the one 30 years later, actually. String lights, catered food. A crowd of admirers gathered to celebrate the golden child's latest triumph. I remember standing in the corner of that party watching my parents beam at Noah like he was the sun they had been orbiting their entire lives. A relative, I don't remember which one, approached me with a plastic cup of lemonade. "Don't worry, honey," she said, patting my arm with the kind of condescension that only family can deliver. "Not everyone is meant to shine. Some people are meant to support those who do." I was 17 years old, and in that moment something crystallized inside me. Not anger exactly, something harder, more useful, determination. I would never be the child they celebrated. Fine. I would be the one they never saw coming. I enrolled in community college while working 3 jobs. I studied business management not because I loved it, but because I understood that money was the only language my family truly respected. I graduated with honors and 0 debt, a fact my parents somehow never thought to acknowledge. Noah graduated from Stanford with a degree in finance and job offers from 3 prestigious banks. Our parents flew to California for his graduation, staying in a hotel they couldn't really afford, posting photographs on social media that made it seem like our entire family had produced this miracle together. They didn't attend my community college graduation. It conflicted with a dinner party they had already committed to. "You understand," my mother said when I called to tell her about the date. "It's just community college. It's not like it's a real ceremony. Not a real ceremony, not a real achievement, not a real daughter worth celebrating." I hung up the phone and made myself a promise. One day, I would build something so substantial that my family would have to acknowledge it. One day, I would force them to see me. Or at the very least, I would make damn sure they regretted never looking. The first garage I ever owned cost me $47,000 and nearly destroyed my marriage before I even had one. I was 23, working as an assistant manager at a quick-service automotive center in a strip mall on the outskirts of Denver. The building was nothing special, a concrete block structure with 3 service bays and a waiting room that smelled permanently of motor oil and stale air. But I loved it. I loved the rhythm of the work, the satisfaction of solving problems that had clear solutions, the way customers looked at me when I fixed something they'd been told couldn't be fixed. The owner was a man named Harold Whitmore, 72 years old, widowed, tired. He'd built the business from nothing 40 years earlier, back when this neighborhood was still farmland, and the highway that now brought customers was just a 2-lane road. Now he was watching it crumble under the weight of competition and changing markets. "I'm done, Grace," he told me one evening after closing. We were sitting in his office, a cluttered room with peeling wood paneling and photographs from better times covering the walls. "Can't keep up anymore. Gonna sell to one of those chain operations. They'll gut the place fire, everyone turn it into another cookie-cutter shop." I asked him how much he wanted it. He laughed. Actually laughed at me, though not unkindly. "Sweetheart, where would you get that kind of money?" I had $47,000 in savings. Every penny I'd earned since I was 14, carefully invested and compounded over nearly a decade. I told him my number. Harold's laughter faded. He studied me for a long moment, seeing something he'd missed before. The determination, perhaps, the same quality Frank had recognized at the car wash all those years ago. "That's about 30,000 short of what I need," he said finally. "I know, but I'll sign a note for the rest, pay you monthly with interest, and I'll let you keep working here as long as you want. Part-time. Keep your hands busy." He sold me the garage 3 weeks later. The paperwork was complicated, the lawyers expensive, and my parents, when I finally told them what I had done, reacted with the kind of horrified disbelief usually reserved for announcements of terminal illness. "You bought a garage," my mother repeated, as if I had told her I was joining a cult. "A car repair place." "Grace, what are you thinking?" I was thinking about independence, about building something that couldn't be taken away, about proving that success didn't require their approval or their understanding. The first year was brutal. I worked 18-hour days learning every aspect of the business through trial and error. I made mistakes, pricing errors, hiring misjudgments, marketing campaigns that fell completely flat. I ate ramen noodles for dinner and slept on a cot in the back office because I couldn't afford both rent and payroll. But I also learned. I learned that customers valued honesty above speed. I learned that employees stayed loyal when you treated them like partners instead of problems. I learned that the automotive service industry was ripe for disruption, that most shops were run by people who understood cars but didn't understand business. I understood business. By the end of that first year, I had turned Harold's failing shop into a profitable operation. By the end of the second year, I had paid off his note completely 3 years ahead of schedule. By the third year, I was ready to expand. The second garage came from a bankruptcy auction. The third from a retiring owner who reminded me of Harold. The fourth, fifth, and sixth came in rapid succession, strategic acquisitions in underserved markets where competition was weak and demand was strong. I structured everything through an LLC I named Ellington Mobility Group. The name was deliberate: mobility, movement. The very quality my family had mocked me for my inability to stay in one place, to settle down, to stop moving, transformed into a brand identity. By my 28th birthday, I owned 6 locations across Colorado. By 39, my monthly net income had grown to over $100,000, a number that still seemed surreal when I saw it in my account statements. And yet my family knew nothing. This was intentional. I had learned early that my parents processed information through a very specific filter. If Noah achieved something, it was evidence of his brilliance. If I achieved the same thing, it was luck or fluke or somehow diminished by circumstances they would invent on the spot. So I kept my success hidden. I drove the same pickup truck I'd owned since college, a Ford F-150 with rust spots and a temperamental heater. I lived in a modest apartment, paid my bills in cash whenever possible, and never posted anything on social media that might suggest prosperity. When my parents asked what I was doing with my life, I told them I worked in automotive services. They assumed this meant I changed oil for minimum wage. I let them assume. "At least you're working," my mother would say in a tone that suggested this was the minimum expectation for someone of my limited potential. Not everyone can have a career like Noah's. Noah by then was working at Hollister Financial Group. He wore expensive suits and talked about quarterly projections and acted as though his salary, a fraction of what my garage generated, made him the family's sole success story. I let him believe it. I let all of them believe it. Because the truth was, I didn't need their validation anymore. I had built something real, something substantial, something that would still be standing long after their illusions crumbled. The mansion came into my possession almost by accident. One of my business advisors mentioned a property in foreclosure, a beautiful colonial revival in a prestigious neighborhood owned by a developer who had overextended himself during the market downturn. The price was absurdly low for what it was. I bought it through Ellington Mobility Group, intending to flip it for profit. But then Noah lost his job. He called me late one night crying harder than I'd ever heard him cry. His voice was raw with panic, each word catching on sobs he couldn't control. "Grace, you can't tell Mom and Dad. They'll die of shame. I made a mistake at work, a big one, and they fired me. Just like that, after everything I gave them." I asked him what he needed. "I need a place to stay, somewhere cheap, just until I get back on my feet." I thought about the mansion sitting empty, waiting for a buyer. I thought about my brother, desperate and humiliated, finally experiencing what it felt like to fail. And I made a decision that would change everything. "I know a place," I told him. "Move in. Don't worry about rent for now. We'll figure it out." I never told him I owned it. I let him believe it was a rental arrangement I'd negotiated on his behalf, a favor from a friend of a friend. He was too relieved to ask questions. 3 months later, he was still unemployed. 6 months after that, he had somehow convinced our parents to move in with him to help with expenses. They consolidated their household into my property without ever knowing it belonged to me. And every month, like clockwork, I paid the mortgage myself. Noah had always been exceptional at one thing above all others, appearing successful. It was a skill he'd honed since childhood, polished through adolescence, and perfected in adulthood. The expensive watch that caught the light at just the right angle. The confident handshake that lingered precisely long enough, the casual name-dropping of clients and colleagues that made everyone assume he was thriving. The reality was considerably more complicated. I learned the truth in fragments pieced together from late-night phone calls and the occasional moment of drunken honesty. Noah hadn't simply made a mistake at Hollister Financial Group. He had made a catastrophic error in judgment, something involving client funds and accounting irregularities that the firm had quietly buried to avoid scandal. The details emerged slowly over the following months. A major client had complained about discrepancies in their portfolio management. An internal audit had revealed patterns that pointed directly to Noah's desk. The amounts weren't enormous, tens of thousands rather than millions, but the breach of trust was total. They'd fired him with a severance package and a non-disclosure agreement, both designed to make the problem disappear. Noah had signed everything without reading it. He was too terrified to negotiate, too ashamed to consult a lawyer. By the time he realized what he'd agreed to, he had effectively blacklisted himself from the financial industry. No references, No recommendations. No path back to the career he'd built his entire identity around. So he did what he did best, he pretended. The social media posts continued with clockwork regularity. Check-ins at upscale restaurants where he ordered water and bread while photographing menu items he couldn't afford. Photographs of golf outings at the country club, carefully cropped to hide the fact that he was there as a guest, not a member. Captions that referenced meetings and projects and the exhausting demands of success. All of it fabricated. All of it funded by money he didn't have. The SUV he drove, a $90,000 Land Rover, was leased under terms that would eventually destroy his credit. The country club membership was paid for by our mother, who had secretly drained her retirement account to support her favorite child's lifestyle. The golf clubs, the designer clothes, the weekend trips to mountain resorts, all of it purchased on credit cards that Noah had no intention or ability to pay off. Our parents were complicit in this deception, though I suspect they didn't fully understand its scope. They believed Noah was experiencing a temporary setback, a brief pause before his inevitable return to glory. They covered his expenses because they couldn't bear the alternative, admitting that their golden child might be ordinary after all. Noah is going through a transition, my mother explained when I asked about his living situation one Sunday dinner. He's pivoting to something new. These things take time. Pivoting. A word borrowed from startup culture to disguise failure as strategy. I watched all of this unfold from a careful distance, documenting everything. Not because I planned revenge, not yet, but because I understood that truth has a way of surfacing eventually, and I wanted to be prepared when it did. The mortgage payments continued. 30 months of them never missed. 30 months of my money sustaining an illusion I had no part in creating. I could have stopped at any time, could have let the bank notices pile up, let foreclosure proceedings begin, let reality crash into my family's fantasy like a wrecking ball. But I didn't. Some part of me still hoped they would figure it out on their own, would recognize the precariousness of their situation, and take steps to address it honestly. They never did. And then came the party. Noah had orchestrated the entire event himself, convincing our parents that he had finally landed a major promotion at a prestigious firm in Chicago. Remote work, he explained, gesturing vaguely at his laptop whenever anyone asked for details. Very cutting edge. The firm preferred discretion, didn't do much public marketing, worked exclusively with high net worth individuals who valued privacy. None of it was true. There was no promotion. There was no firm in Chicago. Noah had spent the previous 3 months driving for a rideshare service, desperately trying to stay ahead of his minimum credit card payments while maintaining the appearance of executive success. But our family wanted to believe. They needed to believe. So they threw him a party, invited 200 guests, and congratulated themselves on producing such a remarkable son. I stood at the edge of that celebration, watching my father proclaim that I would rent forever, and I felt something shift inside me. Not just the familiar ache of being dismissed. Something harder, something that had been building for 30 years, finally reaching the pressure threshold that demanded release. I had enabled this. I had paid for the roof over their heads while they mocked me for not having one. I had funded their fantasy while they pitied my reality. No more. The night of the party, after I sent Cole that single word. Tonight, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to my accountant, confirming that the upcoming mortgage payment would not be processed. The automatic transfer would be canceled. The payment blocked the first deliberate step toward letting the truth emerge. The second was to my lawyer, requesting documentation of every payment I had made on the property over the past 30 months. Bank statements, wire transfer confirmations, everything necessary to prove that I had been carrying this burden alone. The third was to Cole himself, giving him detailed instructions for what would happen when my family returned home. The mansion sat at the end of a cul-de-sac in Cherry Creek North, one of Denver's most prestigious neighborhoods. 3 stories of red brick and white trim, surrounded by mature oak trees that had been there longer than anyone in my family had been alive. When I first purchased it through Ellington Mobility Group, I had imagined flipping it within 6 months for a tidy profit. Instead, it had become a stage set for my family's most elaborate performance. I spent the morning after the party reviewing documentation. Bank statements showing 30 months of mortgage payments totaling over $200,000. Property records confirming Ellington Mobility Group as the sole owner since before Noah moved in. Text messages from Noah thanking me for helping him find such an affordable living situation, completely unaware that the situation was affordable because I was paying for all of it. The texts were particularly damning. Noah had sent me dozens of messages over the years expressing gratitude for my help while simultaneously asking for more. Could I cover the utility bills for a few months? Could I help with the landscaping costs? Each request framed as temporary. Each acceptance on my part, enabling deeper dependency. My lawyer had organized everything into a comprehensive file. If my family wanted to dispute my ownership, they would be fighting against an avalanche of evidence. But I suspected they wouldn't fight. Not legally, anyway. The Ellingtons had always preferred their battles to take place in living rooms and at dinner tables where the weapons were words and the casualties were feelings. My phone rang. Noah's name flashed across the screen. I let it go to voicemail, then listened. Grace, please pick up. I don't understand what's happening. This has to be some kind of mistake. Mom and Dad are losing their minds. They're talking about lawyers, about the police, about I don't even know what. Please, just call me back. We can figure this out. We're family. We're family. As if that phrase had ever protected me from anything. As if family had ever meant something more than obligation and disappointment. I deleted the voicemail and returned to my documentation. The deception had grown so elaborate over the past 2.5 years that untangling it would require patience. Noah had constructed an entire fictional career complete with a fake LinkedIn profile that listed him as senior vice president at a firm that didn't exist, fabricated email correspondence that he showed to relatives when they asked about his work, and carefully staged photographs that suggested professional success. Our parents had either believed the charade completely or had chosen not to look too closely at the inconsistencies. Perhaps they suspected something was wrong and preferred the comfort of denial. The country club membership was the easiest thread to pull. My mother had been wiring Noah money for over 18 months, ostensibly for business expenses and networking opportunities. The amounts varied, sometimes a few $100s, sometimes several thousand, but they always came with the same justification: Noah needed to maintain appearances while he rebuilt his career. I had traced some of these transfers through our shared family phone plan. My mother's retirement account, once healthy, had been gutted. Over $60,000 transferred to Noah under various pretenses. Rebuilt his career. He had spent those 18 months driving strangers to airports and delivering takeout food. The career he was supposedly rebuilding had never existed in the first place. I wondered how my mother would react when she learned the truth. Would she feel betrayed, embarrassed, or would she find a way to blame me the way she always had? The answer came sooner than I expected. Around noon, a knock at my apartment door interrupted my research. I looked through the peephole and saw my mother standing in the hallway, her face puffy from crying, her designer handbag clutched against her chest like a shield. I opened the door. Grace? Her voice cracked on my name. We need to talk. I stepped aside to let her in. She walked past me without meeting my eyes, surveying my modest apartment with an expression that mixed contempt with confusion. Would you like some coffee? I asked. I would like an explanation. She turned to face me, and I saw something I hadn't expected in her eyes. Fear. What you did last night, changing the locks, having that realtor there, it was cruel, Grace. Even for you. Even for me, as if cruelty had always been my defining characteristic. Sit down, I said. I'll explain everything. She perched on the edge of my second-hand sofa, her back rigid with tension. I sat across from her in the armchair I'd purchased at an estate sale 5 years earlier. The mansion belongs to me, I began. I bought it 30 months ago through a company I own. When Noah lost his job and needed somewhere to stay, I offered it to him, free of charge. That's impossible, my mother shook her head. You don't have that kind of money. You work at a garage. I own 9 garages. Across Colorado, my company generates over $100,000 in monthly net income. The silence that followed was absolute. My mother stared at me as if I had suddenly started speaking a language she didn't recognize. "That's not possible," she repeated, but her voice had lost its certainty. "It's very possible. I've been building this business for almost a decade. I just never told you about it." "Why not?" The question hung between us, heavy with implications neither of us wanted to examine too closely. Because every time I accomplished anything, you found a way to diminish it. Community college wasn't a real ceremony. Working wasn't a real career. Nothing I did was ever real enough to matter. So I stopped telling you. I stopped asking for your approval, and I built something real anyway. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. I could see her processing this information, searching for a way to reshape it into something that fit her existing narrative. "If you're so successful," she said finally, "why do you live like this?" I looked around my apartment. The furniture was comfortable, the space was clean, and I had chosen every item with intention. "Because I don't need to prove anything to anyone," I said. "I never did." She left shortly after that, having failed to extract an apology or an explanation that satisfied her. At the door she paused and looked back at me. "Your father is very angry," she said. "He thinks you've made us all look like fools." "I didn't make you look like anything. I just stopped paying for the performance." She had no response to that. The party that night replayed in my mind like a film I couldn't stop watching. Every detail etched itself into my memory with painful clarity. The string lights, the champagne, the sound of my father's laughter as he proclaimed my future of perpetual renting. But it was Noah's comment that stayed with me longest. "Moving house really suits you." He had said it with such casual cruelty, such effortless dismissal, as if my entire existence could be summarized by my inability to stay in one place. He was wrong, of course. I had stayed in one place for years, the place I had built for myself, brick by brick, garage by garage. The moving he mocked wasn't restlessness or failure. It was growth, expansion. The same quality that had allowed me to build an empire while he was busy constructing illusions. 3 days after the lock change, I received a formal letter from a lawyer representing Noah and my parents. They were demanding immediate access to the property, claiming wrongful eviction and emotional distress. The letter was filled with legal language that meant nothing. They had no case, and the lawyer probably knew it, but it was enough to force a conversation. I called Cole. "They're bluffing," he said after reviewing the letter. "They have no legal standing. You own the property. They were living there as guests, not tenants. There's no lease, no rental agreement, no documentation of any kind that suggests they had a right to remain. What do you recommend? Respond through your lawyer. Keep it professional. Offer them 30 days to retrieve their belongings, supervised by a third party. After that, anything left behind becomes abandoned property." It was reasonable. More reasonable than they deserved, probably. But I agreed to it anyway. I wasn't trying to destroy my family, not entirely. I was trying to force them to see the truth. The retrieval process was scheduled for the following Saturday. I didn't attend myself, but Cole provided updates throughout the day. My parents arrived first, accompanied by a rental truck and expressions of barely contained fury. Noah came later alone, looking somehow diminished in the daylight. They spent 6 hours removing furniture, clothing, and personal items from a house they had lived in for over 2 years without ever paying a dime. Cole said the process was mostly silent. No one spoke to him except to ask practical questions about access and timing. When it was over, the mansion stood empty, 3 stories of beautiful architecture waiting for its next chapter. I drove by that evening just to see it. The windows reflected the setting sun, casting golden light across the manicured lawn. It was a beautiful house, too beautiful to have wasted on people who couldn't appreciate what it cost. My phone buzzed with a text from Noah. "Can we talk? Please, I'm begging you." I stared at the message for a long moment, weighing my options. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let him marinate in the consequences of his choices. But another part, the part that still remembered being 7 years old and watching my brother smirk at me across the dinner table, wanted to hear what he had to say. I drove to a coffee shop near his temporary apartment. He was already there when I arrived, hunched over an untouched cup of something cold, looking like a man who hadn't slept in days. Grace. He stood as I approached. Thank you for coming. I sat across from him without responding. Let him do the work. I don't understand, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. All this time you were paying for everything, the mortgage, the utilities, all of it. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you say something? I considered the question. It deserved an honest answer, even if honesty had never been currency in our family. Because you never asked. You moved into that house, and you never once wondered how it was possible. You never questioned why the rent was nothing, why the utilities just happened, why everything worked out so perfectly for you. You just accepted it the way you've accepted everything your whole life. He flinched as if I'd struck him. That's not fair. Isn't it? You've been pretending to have a career for over 2 years, Noah. You've been lying to Mom and Dad, to your friends, to everyone. You've been spending money you don't have on things you don't need, just to maintain an image that was never real in the first place. And the whole time I was the one actually paying for your life, the roof over your head, the foundation of your fantasy. He stared at his coffee cup, unable to meet my eyes. I was ashamed, he said finally. I was so ashamed of losing my job, of failing, of not being who everyone expected me to be. I couldn't face it, so I pretended it wasn't happening. And now, he looked up at me, and I saw something I hadn't expected in his eyes. Not anger, not resentment, something closer to recognition. Now I have to figure out who I actually am, without pretending. I stood to leave. There was nothing more to say. Grace, his voice stopped me at the door. I'm sorry, for the party, for what I said, for all of it. I didn't turn around. That's a start, but sorry it doesn't pay back the 30 months of the mortgage. Cole called me at 11:30 that evening, his voice tight with controlled excitement. It's done, he said. The locks are changed, the security system is updated, and all the documentation is posted on the front door. When they get home, they'll find everything waiting for them. I had orchestrated this moment for weeks, but now that it had arrived, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not satisfied, just a quiet, steel-cold certainty. I hung up the phone and sat in the darkness of my apartment waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I made myself comfortable in the armchair, the one I had bought at an estate sale, and let the darkness of my living room become a sanctuary. The streetlights cast long, narrow shadows through the blinds, and I watched the clock tick toward the early morning hours. I wasn't waiting for revenge. I was waiting for consequence. I was waiting for the universe to finally balance the scales that had been tilted against me for 3 decades. When the calls began around 1:30 in the morning, the sound of the first ring cut through the silence like a gunshot. Noah, then my father, then my mother. I let each one go to voicemail, listening to the phone vibrate violently on the wooden table. The sound was frantic, desperate, a perfect sonic mirror of the chaos I knew was unfolding less than 20 miles away. I collected their messages like evidence, replaying the tone of each accusation, each confused demand, each frightened plea. My father's messages were the most telling. His usual booming authority was stripped away, replaced by a strained, breathless urgency. He mentioned the police, the law, and betrayal, but never once my name. He couldn't acknowledge me even in his fear. My mother's calls were a deluge of misplaced emotion, cycling through anger. How could you do this to your own mother? Grief. We've sacrificed everything for you. And bargaining. Just tell that man it was a mistake. Grace, and things can go back to normal. I didn't reach for the phone. I didn't flinch. I just sat perfectly still, letting the noise wash over me until the phone finally fell silent around 4 a.m. By dawn, the story had begun to spread. One of the neighbors had captured video of the confrontation, Cole calmly explaining the ownership situation while my father shouted and Noah paced frantically on the lawn. The footage had been shared to a neighborhood social media group where it quickly accumulated hundreds of comments. They saw a family being told that their house wasn't actually theirs, and they assumed it was some kind of foreclosure situation, some cautionary tale about living beyond one's means. They had no idea how close to the truth they actually were. The following days brought a cascade of consequences that I hadn't entirely anticipated. Noah's carefully constructed facade began to unravel in public. Someone from the neighborhood group recognized him and connected the mansion incident to his supposed career success. Questions started appearing on his social media, gentle at first, then increasingly pointed. Former colleagues reached out curious about the discrepancy between his claimed position and the foreclosure they had seen online. The truth emerged in fragments: the fake LinkedIn profile, the fabricated emails, the country club membership is funded by our mother's retirement account. Each revelation peeled back another layer of the illusion until there was nothing left but the raw, uncomfortable reality. Noah had been living a lie, and now everyone knows it. My parents retreated into damage control mode. They deleted their social media accounts, stopped returning calls from extended family, and began the slow process of rebuilding their lives without the mansion that had anchored their sense of status. They found a basement apartment in a building owned by one of my father's remaining contacts, a friend from his golf days who owed him a favor. $500 a month, utilities not included. A far cry from the colonial revival in Cherry Creek North. I watched all of this unfold from the careful distance I had always maintained, feeling neither satisfaction nor regret, just a kind of tired recognition that everything I had predicted was finally coming true. 3 weeks after the mansion revelation, I received an unexpected visitor. Noah stood in the hallway outside my apartment looking like someone I barely recognized. Gone were the designer clothes and confident posture. In their place, a man wearing a wrinkled flannel shirt, unshaven shoulders, slumped with a weariness that seemed to go deeper than physical exhaustion. "Can I come in?" he asked. "Please." I stepped aside and let him enter. He looked around my apartment, the same space our mother had surveyed with such confusion, and sank into my second-hand armchair without waiting for an invitation. "Everything's gone," he said, his voice hollow. "The country club membership. The car, they repossessed it yesterday. My credit cards are maxed out, and the collection agencies are calling every day. I applied for a job last week at a bank downtown, and they laughed at me. Actually, I laughed." I sat across from him, maintaining the same careful distance I had cultivated my entire life. "What did you expect?" I asked. "You built your whole life on a foundation of lies. Foundations like that don't hold weight." He looked up at me with eyes that seemed to have aged a decade in 3 weeks. "How did you do it? How did you build something real while I was busy pretending?" It was the first genuine question he had ever asked me. The first time he had approached me not as the inferior sibling, but as someone who might actually know something he didn't. "I started small," I said. "I worked jobs no one else wanted. I saved every penny. I learned from people who had built things with their hands instead of their reputations. And when opportunities came, I was ready." "I could never do that," he said. "I don't know how to start small. I don't know how to be nobody." "You're already nobody, Noah. That's what the past 3 weeks have taught you. The question is whether you can build something from that, or whether you'll spend the rest of your life mourning the person you pretended to be." He sat with that for a long moment, and I watched something shift in his expression. Not acceptance exactly, more like the first tentative acknowledgement that acceptance might eventually be possible. "I got a job," he said finally. "At a garage, actually. Basic mechanic work. Minimum wage plus tips. The owner said I could learn while I worked, maybe move up eventually." A garage. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. "Which one?" I asked. He named a location on the south side of Denver, not one of mine, but a competitor I respected. Good people, fair wages, a decent place to start over. "That's good," I said. "Honest work builds honest lives." He nodded slowly, then stood to leave. At the door, he paused and looked back at me. "I understand now," he said. "Why did you never tell us about your success? We wouldn't have believed it. We wouldn't have wanted to believe it. You being successful would have meant admitting we were wrong about you. And we never wanted to be wrong." It was the closest thing to an apology I had ever received from my brother, not for a specific action, but for a lifetime of dismissal, for a pattern of behavior so ingrained that neither of us had ever named it until now. "Thank you," I said, "for seeing that." He left, and I stood in my doorway watching him walk down the hall, a diminished man beginning the long work of becoming something new. I didn't know if he would succeed. Transformation is difficult, and old patterns have deep roots. But for the first time in our lives, I believed he might actually try. 6 months after the mansion incident, the full scope of Noah's financial collapse became apparent. Without the subsidized housing I had provided, without the country club connections he had used to maintain appearances, without the credit cards that had funded his fictional lifestyle, my brother was forced to confront reality for the first time in his adult life. The results were not pretty. The SUV repossession was just the beginning. Collection agencies pursued him for credit card debt, totaling over $80,000, a number that seemed impossible until I reviewed the statements Cole had obtained through legal channels. Designer clothes purchased at full retail price, restaurant meals that cost more than my weekly grocery budget, weekend trips to ski resorts where he posed for photographs suggesting professional success. Each purchase had been a brick in the wall of pretense that had finally come tumbling down. His friends disappeared one by one as they realized the successful banker they had admired was actually a rideshare driver drowning in debt. The social media connections that had propped up his image became conduits for gossip instead of congratulations. Former colleagues shared his story as a cautionary tale, never realizing they were describing a man who had once been celebrated as the golden child of our family. My parents handled the fallout in their characteristic way, denial followed by deflection. When relatives called asking about the mansion, they invented stories about market conditions and strategic decisions to downsize. When neighbors from their old life ran into them at grocery stores, they smiled and changed the subject and pretended everything was fine. But everything was not fine. The basement apartment where they had landed was cramped and dim with water stains on the ceiling and a heating system that groaned through the night. My father, stripped of the status symbols that had defined his identity, retreated into a kind of sullen withdrawal. He barely spoke at family gatherings, what few there were, and seemed to have aged a decade in 6 months. My mother filled the silence with accusations against the economy, against Noah's former employer, against anyone except the people actually responsible. She never quite blamed me directly, but I could feel the weight of her unspoken accusations in every strained conversation we had. They never accused me directly, but I could feel the weight of their unspoken blame in every strained conversation we had. I was the daughter who had exposed their illusions. I was the one who had forced them to see themselves clearly. Some people might feel guilty about that. I felt something closer to vindication. Meanwhile, the mansion found a new purpose. I had it professionally cleaned and staged, then listed it for rent at market rate $12,800 per month with a 2-year minimum lease. Within 3 weeks, I had signed a contract with a family relocating from California, a surgeon and her husband with 2 teenage children who would attend the private school down the street. The first rent check arrived on the same day Noah started his new job at the garage on the south side. I deposited it into the account that funded Ellington Mobility Group's expansion efforts, where it joined the revenue from 9 other locations, generating consistent monthly income. My wealth continued to grow invisible and unacknowledged by the family that had spent my entire life predicting my failure. Noah, to his credit, stuck with the garage job longer than I expected. His supervisor reported that he was a quick learner, good with customers, reliable in ways his previous career had never required. The work was physical, demanding, and completely devoid of prestige, everything my brother had spent his life avoiding. And yet he showed up every day. He learned to change oil and rotate tires and explain repair estimates to frustrated customers. He earned $16 an hour plus modest tips, a fraction of what he had once claimed to make, but every penny of it was real. I monitored his progress from a distance through Cole and through occasional reports from contacts in the industry. I wasn't ready to rebuild our relationship. The wounds were too fresh, the patterns too entrenched, but I was curious. Could Noah actually change? Could the golden child learn to value substance over appearance? The question haunted me more than I wanted to admit. 1 year after the mansion incident, I opened my 10th garage location. The expansion had been planned for months, a strategic acquisition in Fort Collins, targeting the college town market I had identified as underserved. The deal closed on a Tuesday morning, witnessed only by my lawyer and the seller's representative. No champagne, no celebration, just paperwork and handshakes and the quiet satisfaction of watching another piece fall into place. By then, my network had grown beyond Colorado, a location in Cheyenne, Wyoming, another in Salt Lake City, Utah. Each one carefully selected, painstakingly developed, and consistently profitable. Ellington Mobility Group had become a regional player, generating enough revenue to attract attention from private equity firms looking for acquisitions. I turned them all down. I hadn't built this empire to hand it over to strangers in suits who cared only about quarterly returns. I had built it to prove something to myself, to my family, to everyone who had ever looked at me and seen nothing but limitations. The irony was that no one in my family knew the extent of my success. My parents still believed I worked at a single garage doing manual labor for hourly wages. They had never asked for details, and I had never volunteered them. But other people were starting to notice. A feature in the Denver Business Journal highlighted my company's growth trajectory and innovative approach to customer service. A local news station ran a segment on women entrepreneurs in traditionally male-dominated industries, and my name appeared prominently. Speaking invitations arrived from business schools and women's leadership organizations requesting my perspective on building something from nothing. I accepted a few of these invitations, carefully selecting audiences where I could make a difference without exposing myself to my family's attention. At a conference for female founders, I shared the story of buying Harold's failing garage at 23, of sleeping on a cot in the back office, of learning to run a business through trial and error. At a community college career fair, I told students that the path to success doesn't always run through prestigious universities and traditional credentials. The response was overwhelming. Women approached me after these events, their eyes bright with possibility, asking how I had done it, how I had started with nothing and built something substantial, how I had kept going when everyone around me said I would fail. I told them the truth, determination, patience, and the refusal to let other people's limitations become my own. One of these women, a single mother named Denise who had been laid off from a factory job, became my first mentee. I helped her develop a business plan for a mobile car detailing service, connected her with financing options, and provided ongoing guidance as she navigated the challenges of entrepreneurship. Denise's success inspired me to formalize the process. I established a program called Lift Women Forward, offering mentorship resources and small grants to women building businesses in underserved markets. The program grew quickly, fueled by my network of contacts and my genuine belief that potential exists everywhere, waiting to be recognized. My parents heard about Lift Women Forward through a relative who had seen the news coverage. My mother called me, her voice tinged with the confusion I had grown accustomed to. "Is this really you?" she asked, "running some kind of charity for women?" "It's not a charity," I said. "It's an investment in people who remind me of myself." She didn't know how to respond to that. We ended the call without resolution, as we always did, but something had shifted. My success was becoming too visible to ignore. Sooner or later, my family would have to acknowledge the daughter they had spent 30 years dismissing. I was ready for that moment, more than ready. 18 months after the mansion incident, Noah called and asked to meet. Not at my apartment where the power dynamics felt too weighted in my favor, not at the basement apartment where the remnants of our family's humiliation still lingered. Instead, he suggested a neutral location, Sunrise Cafe, a modest diner on the east side of Denver that neither of us had ever visited. I agreed more out of curiosity than reconciliation. My brother had been working at the garage for over a year now, maintaining steady employment and staying out of trouble. The collection agencies had worked out payment plans for his debts, which he was slowly addressing through garnished wages and careful budgeting. It was progress of a sort, but progress isn't the same as transformation. And transformation was what I needed to see before I could consider anything resembling forgiveness. The cafe was nearly empty when I arrived, just a few early risers nursing coffee and a waitress who looked like she'd been working since dawn. Noah was already seated in a booth near the back, 2 untouched cups of coffee on the table between us. He looked better than the last time I'd seen him. Still worn, still carrying the weight of his choices, but something in his posture suggested stability rather than desperation. "Thank you for coming," he said as I sat down. I wrapped my hands around the coffee cup without drinking. "You said you wanted to talk." He took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about the past year, about everything that happened, about who I was and who I'm trying to become." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you an acknowledgement." "Of what?" "Of everything. Of being wrong about you my whole life. Of treating you like you were less than me when the truth is you were always more. More determined, more resilient, more real." I said nothing. Let him continue. "I used to think success was about appearances," he said. "About having the right job and the right clothes and the right friends. I never considered that someone could build something substantial without any of those things, without being seen at all." "Building something substantial requires exactly that," I said. "The willingness to work without being seen, to keep going when no one is watching or applauding, or telling you how exceptional you are." He nodded slowly. "I understand that now. I'm not sure I could have understood it before everything fell apart." "And Mom and Dad?" I asked. "Do they understand?" Noah's expression shifted, becoming more complicated. "They're struggling. Dad barely talks anymore. Mom keeps looking for someone to blame. Neither of them knows how to make sense of what happened. They could start by looking in the mirror." "I know, but they're not ready for that yet. Maybe they never will be." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of our family's dysfunction settling between us like a third presence at the table. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Noah said finally. "I know I haven't earned it. I'm asking for a chance to show you that I've changed, that the person I was at that party, the one who mocked you for moving, who joined Dad in laughing at your future, that person doesn't exist anymore." I studied my brother's face, searching for traces of the arrogance that had defined him for as long as I could remember. I found something different instead. Humility, perhaps. Or at least the beginnings of it. "Forgiveness isn't something I can offer right now," I said. "Not because I'm holding on to anger, but because forgiveness requires trust. And trust takes time to rebuild." "I understand. But I'm willing to give you that time. To see who you become." It wasn't much, not a reconciliation, not a restoration of the relationship we'd never really had, just an opening, a possibility. Noah reached across the table, not to touch me, but to push something toward me. An envelope slightly crumpled. "What's this?" I asked. "The first payment on what I owe you. Not the mortgage. I know I can't ever repay that, but this is a start. Something to show you I mean what I say." I opened the envelope and found a check for $500. A pittance compared to the $200,000 I had spent on the mansion, but earned honestly through work that Noah had never imagined himself doing. It was perhaps the most meaningful amount of money anyone in my family had ever given me. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it. My parents arrived at the cafe 20 minutes later, a detail Noah had failed to mention when he invited me. I considered leaving, but something held me in place. The desire for closure, maybe, or just the recognition that this moment had been building for 30 years. My mother looked older than I remembered. The past 18 months had carved lines into her face that hadn't existed before. My father moved slowly, carefully, as if the world had become more fragile than he knew how to navigate. They slid into the booth across from me, and for a long moment no one spoke. My mother broke the silence first. "Grace, I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything," I said. "Just listen." I told them about my garage, about Ellington Mobility Group, about the wealth I had built while they were predicting my failure. I told them about Lift Women Forward and the mentees I was helping, about the expansion into neighboring states, about the media coverage they had somehow missed or ignored. Their expressions moved through disbelief into something more complicated. Not acceptance exactly, more like the first tentative steps toward understanding that their assumptions had been wrong. "Why didn't you tell us?" my father asked, his voice rough with something that might have been regret. "Because you wouldn't have believed me, and because I didn't need you to. I built my life without your approval, and I'll continue building it whether you approve or not." My mother's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For everything I said, for everything I believed about you." "I know," I said, "but sorry doesn't undo decades of dismissal. It doesn't heal the child who watched you celebrate her brother while ignoring her achievements. It doesn't restore the years I spent believing I would never be enough." "Then what do you want from us?" my father asked. I considered the question carefully. What did I want? Not revenge that had already been accomplished, not reconciliation that felt too much like surrender. What I wanted was simpler, harder, more essential. "I want you to see me," I said. "Not the daughter you wished I was, not the failure you predicted. Me. The person I actually became while you weren't watching." The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. My parents looked at each other, then back at me, and I saw something shift in their eyes. Not transformation that would take years if it happened at all, but recognition. The first acknowledgement that the daughter they had dismissed might have been someone worth knowing all along. It wasn't enough. It might never be enough, but it was a start. 2 years after the party where my father proclaimed I would rent forever, I stood on the balcony of my penthouse apartment and watched the sun rise over the Rocky Mountains. The view stretched for miles, snow-capped peaks, catching the first light of morning, the city of Denver spreading below like a circuit board of possibility. I had purchased this apartment 6 months earlier, not because I needed the space or the prestige, but because I wanted to finally live in a way that reflected who I had become. After a decade of deliberate minimalism, of hiding my success behind secondhand furniture and rust-spotted trucks, I was ready to be seen. The mansion in Cherry Creek North had become one of my most profitable investments. The surgeon and her family had extended their lease for another 3 years, paying rent that more than covered the original mortgage payments and generated substantial monthly income. What my family had viewed as their entitlement had become my passive wealth generator. My garage empire had grown to 16 locations across 4 states. Ellington Mobility Group employed over 200 people, many of them women who had come through the Lift Women Forward program. We had become known in the industry for our innovative approach to customer service and our commitment to developing talent from non-traditional backgrounds. The business press had taken notice. A feature in Forbes called me one of the Midwest's most successful self-made entrepreneurs. An interview with a national morning show introduced my story to millions of viewers. The daughter who would rent forever had become the woman who owned everything. My family's reaction to my public success was complicated, as family reactions always are. Noah had continued his slow transformation. He had been promoted to shift supervisor at his garage, earned a certification in automotive technology, and started paying down his debts with genuine commitment. We saw each other occasionally now, not as close siblings, but as 2 people learning to respect each other for the first time. "I tell people about you," he said during one of our meetings. "At work when they complain about their situations. I tell them about my sister who built an empire from nothing, who proved that success doesn't require permission. It was perhaps the greatest gift he had ever given me. My parents remained more difficult. The basement apartment had been replaced by a modest 2-bedroom rental in a quiet neighborhood, not luxurious but stable. My father had found part-time work as a consultant for a small accounting firm, using skills he had developed decades ago, before Noah's success had made him comfortable enough to stop working. My mother had joined a church group that focused on community service, channeling her need for status into something more constructive. She called me occasionally, our conversations careful and polite, circling around the deeper issues we both knew existed. We would never be close. Too much history stood between us, too many years of dismissal and disappointment. But we had achieved something like acceptance, an acknowledgement that our relationship would never match the ideal either of us might have wanted. That was enough. It had to be enough. I took a sip of my morning coffee and watched the city wake up below me. The woman I saw reflected in the glass door was someone my childhood self would barely recognize, successful, confident, at peace with who she had become. They said I would rent forever. They said I would never amount to anything. They laughed at my jobs and my choices and my stubborn refusal to follow the path they had mapped out for me. And now I owned everything they had ever valued: the mansion, the success, the recognition they had reserved exclusively for their golden child. All of it mine, built with my own hands, without their help or approval or belief. There is a particular satisfaction in proving people wrong. Not the vindictive pleasure of revenge, though that had its moment. Something deeper. The quiet knowledge that you have become exactly who you were meant to be, regardless of what anyone else thought possible. I thought about Grace, the 7-year-old, sitting at that dinner table, watching her brother receive praise she would never earn. The teenager worked 3 jobs to save for a future no one believed she would have. The young woman bought her first garage with $47,000 and a dream that seemed impossible. She had become me. And I was grateful for every struggle, every dismissal, every moment of being underestimated that had forged me into someone capable of building something real. The sun had fully risen now, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink. Below my balcony, Denver began its daily rhythm. Cars moving through streets, people heading to jobs, a city full of dreams waiting to be realized. I had one more call to make before starting my day. "Cole," I said when he answered, "I want to discuss expanding into California. I think we're ready." He laughed, that warm, knowing laugh of a friend who had watched me grow from a single garage to a regional empire. "Of course you're ready," he said. "You've always been ready. You were just waiting for the rest of the world to catch up." I smiled and finished my coffee, watching the sunlight spread across the city I had conquered. If you have ever been dismissed by the people who should have believed in you, I want you to know something. Their limitations are not your destiny. Their doubts are not your truth. You can build something extraordinary from nothing but determination and time. My family said I would rent forever. They were wrong about everything, and now every month they watch me collect rent on the life they thought belonged to them. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever been the overlooked child, the dismissed daughter, the person everyone expected to fail, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and share your own journey. Like this video if you believe in karma and redemption. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories of women who refuse to let anyone else define their worth. Because the truth is, we are everywhere, building quietly, growing steadily, becoming the people our families never imagined we could be, and our stories are